Today is a very special podcast. Sir Vincent Cable is joining me. A very, very interesting. Oh, good. We'll start that again. Today on the podcast is a very special day. Sir Vincent Cable joins me. He's a very interesting man. He spent a lot of time in Parliament with the Liberal Democrats, but he started off actually with different parties. So, Sir Vincent, welcome to the podcast.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Hopefully you're doing very well. So do you want to start us off then with your early days in politics? Who actually got you into it?
Well, I was active as a student when I was an undergraduate. After I left university, I went to live in Kenya for a while, not in British politics at all. I was working for Jomo Kenyatta. But when I came back to the UK, I went with my wife, now Olympia, to Glasgow. And while I was in Glasgow, I got politically involved. I stood for Parliament and actually got elected to Glasgow City Council, which is a bit unusual. That was early 70s. And I suppose what got me into politics was partly living in a city that's very political, big challenges, the decline of manufacturing industry, bad housing. I got involved in some of the protest marches around the closure of Upper Clyde shipbuilders. Also, my wife was Kenyan Asian, so I got very heavily involved in all the dramas around immigration, Enoch Powell's speeches, racism, anti-apartheid. And so those things had the effect of politicizing me. And in Glasgow, the Labour Party were the only really serious party, and they took me on, and I ran for Parliament and the council.
How was your time in Kenya? Because I've done quite a few bits in Kenya, but I've never actually been. So what's it like to be there politically, but also just normally as well?
Well, I was there at an unusual time, I guess. It was shortly after independence. There was a lot of uncertainty. And I was on a kind of special scheme called the ODI Fellowship Scheme, where young economics graduates were sent to plug holes in the administration before African graduates came along to occupy them. And I was in a ludicrously important role, given that I'd only just left college with a degree. But it was a fantastic experience for me. I think I probably got far more out of it than the Kenyans. But anyway, but living in the country, it's very beautiful, interesting, diverse. I was more interested in the people than the animals, but there's a combination that. And I also fell in love with a young woman who'd actually been at a British university, York, but her home was in Kenya. So we got together and married. Well, happily married actually for 30 odd years until she sadly died of cancer. So, Kenya was quite an important moment in my life.
So you joined the Labour Party, as you mentioned, and then you moved on to the Social Democratic Party. But there's not, they are left of the political system, but what is the main differences back then between the two parties that you ended up to join before the Liberal Democrats?
Well, my move wasn't particularly unusual at the time. There was a kind of civil war in the Labour Party after the failure of the Callaghan government. The winter of discontent, in came Margaret Thatcher. There's a feeling that there was a kind of malaise in the country and we wanted a radical change. And within the Labour Party, you got a hard left factions. Certainly in where I lived, I now lived in London, you had kind of Trotskyite groups that I felt I had absolutely nothing in common with. I was quite comfortable with the old mainstream of the Labour Party. I'd worked for John Smith, who was leader of the party, until sadly he died prematurely. And I would have been perfectly happy continuing with people like that. But the hard left took over many areas of the party, including the ones I live, and like a lot of other kind of centre-left people, I left to join the SDP and stood for the SDP Liberal Alliance in the next election, 1983. The Gang of Four, as they're remembered, led by Roy Jenkins, Shirley Williams, David Owen, Shirley Williams, and Bill Rogers. They were, iconic figures in the Labour Party at the time, and a lot of people like me followed their lead.
You mentioned that you got elected onto Glasgow Council. What was your first proper experience of having to deal with the public in your position?
Well, it was a real eye-opening experience. I'm not quite sure how, but I got adopted and elected in one of the safest wards in the city. And it was a time of kind of political upheaval, and there was a group of us who were elected to the council at the same time who finished up in leadership roles, and I chaired, important committees on the council to deal with planning and transport, and some of the things I did at the time, we're talking half a century ago, still remain. I mean, I stopped the Maryhill motorway, which was carving up a big working class community. I was heavily involved in refurbishment of the public transport, the new Clockwork Orange, the new underground system in Glasgow. And yeah, I mean, I had an email a few months ago from an angry Glasgow resident who discovered that I was chairman of the committee that had produced some parking scheme that was causing absolute havoc 50 years later, and he was holding me responsible.
Well, that must be quite an awkward one. How did you actually end up dealing with that?
Well, I mean, now obviously there were plenty of opportunities to change it. I mean, parking is one of these issues that gets people going. It isn't party political in any obvious sense, and certainly when I was responsible, there weren't many cars around. But the situation had become unsustainable in subsequent decades.
So how have parties changed over time? Because I suppose one obvious thing would be social media. But back in the day when you were on the road campaigning, what was it actually like? What's the difference between then and now?
Oh, it was well different. I mean, partly you've put your finger on the social media factor, which even when I entered Parliament in 1997 was, I mean, it wasn't there. I mean, we were only just beginning to discover emails. I think back when I first dabbled in politics, early 70s, campaigning was pretty crude. You had a couple of leaflets, usually not very sophisticated, probably run off a Roneo machine. A lot of campaigning was knocking on doors, shouting through a loudhailer, even, writing chalk on the pavement. So I had one episode when I fell out with a Catholic priest because we'd run some slogans on the pavement outside on Sunday morning. But it was a very different world from the kind of mass communication of today.
You mentioned that there's a different world. I mean, even my parents speak about it, about how the world's changed in the last 20 or 30 years. For you, was the world better? I know it's more simple about then, but was it better then or better now?
Well, it was then rougher, cruder, less informed. I mean, the problem now is this demand for instant reaction. I mean, a lot of problems do require reflection, establishing an evidence base. It's very difficult when people are under pressure to give instant reaction to something that has appeared on social media that may or may not be true. And we've got sucked into an environment of short-termism. I mean, I'm not currently part of Parliament, but this idea we seem to have got that we've got to change the Prime Minister every 6 months because they've done something we don't like. I mean, it's just a bizarre way of looking at government and looking at politics.
I often say, though, that American presidents, they all seem to see out their term, but a prime minister can't, which to me is unbelievable. Again, that's changed in the last 15 years, right?
Yes, I think what has happened in the UK is partly a kind of long tail from things that happened quite a long time ago. I think the financial crisis, 2008-9, which, apart from anything else, made me a celebrity, sort of. But it did terrible damage to the British economy. It was a bit like an economic heart attack. And, years after, government's debt, people's living standards are affected, and it generally created the kind of bad feeling that we're still living with. And Brexit was the other factor, which has caused a deep division in society, a feeling that as a country we made a bad mistake, but nothing we can do about it. All those things have contributed to a kind of malaise. Um, in my period in government, in the cabinet, 2010-15, the coalition was before Brexit, and we did have 5 years of stability. I mean, not everything we did was popular, but there were things that had to be done to get the public finances back into some kind of stable order. And it was good government, whether you liked it or not, whatever the disagreements, it was stable, regular. All of the top posts, including mine, we stuck out our 5 years, and we were able to do quite a lot of stuff.
In nine, go on.
In our case, around the industrial strategy, setting up the British Business Bank, the Green Investment Bank, the Catapult Network on innovation, all kind of stuff which has survived the test of time. And it's now very difficult to do that in a government where ministers and, above all, prime ministers are chopping and changing every few months.
1997, you mentioned, was the first year you got elected as a member of parliament. What was your whole campaigning experience like? Was that the first time you ever ran to be an MP?
No, I got elected on the fifth attempt, and 30 years after I first tried. The first attempt was in Glasgow, then twice in York, and twice in Twickenham. And it was obviously my last attempt. I was in my mid-50s by then. My family's patience had been extended to exhaustion. I would never have done this had my wife in particular, Olympia, not been behind me. So yeah, it came after a very, very long period of trying.
And again, that whole campaigning experience for you, I suppose that they often say that once you lose an election, you have that post-election loss depression, or it's very hard to get back on your feet. But to do it at the fifth attempt must have been quite something.
Well, yes, I've had quite a few up and downs. I mean, in 2015, I lost again and then had to win the seat back 2 years later. And the trauma in 2015 was quite severe. You've been one of the top politicians in the country. Everything seemed to be fine, and then the following day you're suddenly out of a job, and your local people have rejected you. So it's quite a difficult psychological shock. And I got through it thanks to my wife, really, and the kind of close, loving relationship with my children, and they rallied around. And I had a good team in Twickenham who felt, this was a mistake, we can correct this, and they did. So you need quite a lot of psychological and emotional support when you lose from a winning position, which is what I'd done.
Well, I suppose you were fortunate enough to have an election only 2 years later. When you do lose your election, what is actually? I hear that you get is it 6 or 7 months' wages, and then you seem to have to find a new job.
Well, it's not just the money. Actually, is quite generous. You do get the pension's a very good one in Parliament. I'm not quite sure how the redundancy thing works, but you do get a payment. In my case, and I think in most people's case, it's a sort of sense of humiliation, right? You've lost, and you've lost very publicly, and you have to live with that. And if you're younger, I mean, I was past retirement age, but if you're younger, you have to, get a job to support your family. I mean, I was particularly concerned about some of my guys. Jo Swinson, for example, she and her husband both lost on the same day, and they had to put their life back together again. They've got a young baby. And it's a stuff. I mean, I'm not asking people to feel sorry for politicians. I'm very much the opposite. But I think people do need to realise that being a politician as opposed to being a public servant or a commentator does expose you not just to a quite a high level of aggression, but the possibility. You've got your life, your job on the line whenever there's an election.
As an MP, you can build a backroom team, as I've found out quite recently. So, in your backroom team, who did you have? Was it caseworkers, photographers? What was? Yeah.
Well, I was very lucky. I had some very, very good people. There was Lady Ducey, as she now is, was my election agent, and she stuck with me for several elections, and her organisational skills helped me get me elected. I had a Twickenham casework team, a secretarial team who were with me for 20 years. I mean, they were very loyal, very competent, very stable. They knew the area, and this makes a big difference because a lot of the mistakes politicians make is often they have an inexperienced team who don't know what they're doing. But when you've got hundreds, sometimes thousands of emails or letters coming into you, you've got dramas, crises popping up all over the place. You need somebody to help you get properly organised. And I was fortunate.
What was it like to be the acting leader of the Liberal Democrats?
I didn't enjoy that, frankly. I mean, it was a privilege. I was in a distinguished line, Paddy Ashdown, Charles Kennedy, Joe Grimman before that. It's quite a distinguished thing to have done. But it was way disappointing because, first of all, I got the job by default. None of the other MPs were willing to challenge me. So I never really had the legitimacy of winning a contested election. I realised that we were then didn't have many MPs in Parliament. I think 12 at the time. They were lovely, and we worked together very effectively as a team. But the problem is, it's very difficult to get access to the media when you're in that position. When I was a cabinet minister, I would have the BBC, ITV onto me every day, wanting a comment statement. But when you're leader of a small party, even if we had a very clear cause, which we did, we were, looking for a people's vote on Brexit. Nobody comes to you. It's very difficult to get attention. Then people start getting restless. Why isn't the leader on television more? Obviously, he isn't trying. And then you have all the office politics, trying to manage internal party discipline issues, complaints, and it becomes very, very exhausting and debilitating. And my 5 years as a cabinet minister were very, very tough, and there were a lot of crises. But in a way, it was exhilarating, and you felt you were achieving something. But my 2 years as a party leader were frankly a bit miserable. There were high points. We did brilliantly well in the elections in 2019, European elections. We pretty much matched the Reform Party, up in the 20s in the opinion polls. But apart from those old high points, it wasn't a great experience.
Not long after that was 2009, and there was a crisis around expenses that MPs were overspending. Could you talk to me a bit about that? Firstly, how much do you get to spend as an MP? But secondly, could you give me a bit more of an insight into the crisis that happened?
Well, this was a long time before. The expenses crisis was 2009, I think.
Yeah.
And basically what had happened was that MPs have a basic salary. I think it's now 80,000 plus, but I think in that time it was late 50s. I may have got my figures wrong. But a lot of MPs' money, came through expenses. Now, some of this was just covering the cost of offices. Some of it was covering the cost of overnight stays in London, people coming from far away. But what had happened was that the regulations around expenses were either unclear or they weren't very tightly enforced. And the Daily Telegraph, I think, did an investigation and found that large numbers of MPs were claiming expenses for ridiculous things. There was the famous duck pond. Some of these Tories with big estates were climbing all kind of nonsense, but not just the Tories. It was across all parties. Some MPs had become very cynical. They were claiming for things that they had no right to claim for. And in one or two cases, there was criminal illegality. Actually, some MPs went to prison. This has now been forgotten. And the whole parliamentary system, frankly, became into considerable disrepute for a while. I mean, I was lucky, but maybe I was lucky or more careful, I don't know, but nobody found a fault with my claims. And I emerged as one of the people who was thought to be rather saintly, which is not really quite the case, but at least I avoided trouble at that point.
And how much do you get to spend in terms of expenses?
Sorry, how much?
Do you have as expenses for an MP?
Well, it's different categories of things. You get paid to run the office, right? Basic office expenses are covered. Travel expenses, people travel by train or plane from different parts of the country, and that's a separate budget category. Then there is overnight accommodation, and then there's a basic salary. So the expenses are in these various boxes. And it was, as I say, it was a little bit blurred and unclear until the expenses scandal forced a clarification about what MPs were entitled to and what they weren't.
2010, in May, there was a coalition government formed. What was the chaos like of that night, finding out that there would be a coalition government and who it would be between?
Well, we had done a little, certainly in the Lib Dems, we had done a little bit of scenario planning around this, but it nonetheless took most of us by surprise because of the numbers. I think people like me were expecting that the Labour government would return, but with a reduced majority. And if we were required to do anything, it'd be working with Gordon Brown. I had no problem with. I saw him as a perfectly decent man who'd done a good job in managing the financial crisis. But the way the numbers worked out, it was very awkward because the only way you could get a stable government was us working with the Conservatives. Moreover, we had this very serious financial crisis that required parties to work together. This was not a time to engage in party political squabbling. So, we effectively found ourselves having to form a coalition with the Tories. There's been some debate as to whether Nick Clegg really wanted that more than the rest of us. I don't know. Historians will continue to dig around this, but the negotiations inexorably led us to a coalition with the Conservatives.
And throughout your time there, we will speak a bit more about what you did as a cabinet minister. Is it a bit harder to work in government with another party because ultimately you've just got a whole mix-up?
Well, it's hard in one sense that, you are dealing with people who have different priorities. They got elected on a different manifesto, and there are often temperamental differences. I actually relished it. I had no problems with working with other people. I mean, I was used to working in organizations with people of different nationalities and so on. And, you have to work as a team, whatever you're doing. So I didn't have a big problem, and I had a fairly simple message for the Conservatives. We had in my department 2 Lib Dems, me under junior minister, which included Ed Davey at one point, Joe Swinson, Norman Lamb, and we had, I think, 6, some occasions 7 Tories as junior ministers. And my message to them was quite clear that, leave your weapons at the door. We've got a job to do. Let's work together. And I think in the process, I formed, I wouldn't say friendship, maybe overstating it, but very good working relationships. For example, with David Willits, who was the university's minister, a very bright and likable guy now in the House of Lords. Matt Hancock was, I think, sent to the department to give me grief, but actually it turned out to be quite a good colleague, and we managed to work together well.
When you got told you were going to be a cabinet minister, firstly, were you excited? And secondly, how did you find out?
Well, it was assumed that I would have one of the senior jobs in the government because I was Nick Clegg's deputy, and I was the shadow chancellor, as we put it. And I was hoping, actually, that I would finish up with the Chancellor's job because I'd spoken a lot about banking, and that was the crisis at the time. I felt I was competent and knew enough about economic policy to make a good job of it. But that wasn't on offer. And so I went to the other major economic ministry in the government, which is BIS, which is big enough. I mean, it was business, universities, skills, trade, quite a lot of other things. So it was a big job. I had no prior briefing before I got into government, but I took it on and, as I say, was there for 5 years.
I suppose when you take on a cabinet role, you spend a lot less time in your constituency doing normal day-to-day junior minister MP roles. So when you took on this role, what was your first? How did you really start to float the ship? How did you manage to get everything on track?
Well, organizing your life is it's not easy for some of the reasons you've suggested. I mean, because I had a very good, competent, loyal team in Twickenham in my constituency office, they were, they were able to just get on with the job, looking after local people and their concerns. I managed to keep up my weekly advice surgery. I was always in the constituency, preferably at the weekends, around a lot. But if you do lose track, for sure, I mean, it's very difficult to concentrate as carefully on local issues as you did before you became a minister in a big role.
Prior to you getting a cabinet role, what would you say was the most important thing that your local MP could do? Is it A, being in public and just being in the public eye and being in the local town? Or is it B, doing the casework and working hard behind the scenes, but no one really tends to see you about?
Well, it's a bit of each, actually. And the local casework is very important because I was in Parliament for 20 years and there were thousands and thousands of people who would come to me for advice, assistance, and it all adds up. And you build up if you're conscientious, you build up a good reputation. So that is important. But I think probably more important was acting as a kind of spokesman, representative for the community. I had numerous what are called adjournment debates, which was a way of highlighting issues that were important, mainly in Twickenham, but not exclusively so. So becoming a kind of voice for the local area on topical issues was extremely important. At that time, of course, we had local newspapers. So what you did was reported. Now, it isn't. So I'm not quite sure how MPs project their constituency role. My replacement, who took over from me, is Munira Wilson. This is a very capable Lib Dem MP, and she sends out a lot of kind of report backs to local people, leaflets explaining what she's been doing. And you have to do that. And even if you're a minister, you have to try to keep that going.
So talk to me then about your time as a cabinet minister. I know that there was a bit of controversy. So what would you say is the biggest pro to what you did and how you benefited the country, but also your biggest failure as the cabinet minister?
Well, I was thrown into some very, very tricky issues right from the very beginning. One was simply agreeing to the program of cuts in public spending that we had theoretically agreed before the election was absolutely necessary, but it was very painful when you actually got there. And people are saying, well, you've got to cut this or cut that. And you know that people's jobs are on the line. So there was the whole of that first wave of very painful public spending cuts. On top of that, there were arguments within the coalition, and I was portrayed, I think probably wrongly, but sort of the left-wing voice of the party in the cabinet. There were certainly tensions over a whole lot of issues, welfare spending, many other things. Also, there was the absolutely toxic issue of university tuition fees, because there was no way that the government could continue to pay for university level education for 40% of the population. It was not affordable. And the Labour Party had agreed that we needed to have a fee loan system to finance it. But under a lot of pressure, to be fair to him, Nick Clegg had promised that they would be frozen. That was just not doable. I mean, the money was not there. So I, unfortunately, had the responsibility of introducing a reform system which we tried to make as fair as possible, but nonetheless inevitably involved breaking the pledge that Nick had given before the election. And that led to kind of street riots, all kind of aggressive hostility, which we had to live with. And then thirdly, I got into a public fight with Mr. Murdoch over B-Sky, his takeover of B-Sky B television. I effectively blocked it, but in the process was overheard to have said some rude things in private that I shouldn't have said, and that led to another round of recriminations. So the first 6 months was quite tough, all those issues coming together. And I was also, as it happened, I'd been recruited to go on to Strictly Come Dancing for the winter program. And so I was doing rehearsals for the program while all these dramas were going around. So it was, yeah, it was an exciting time.
And how was your Strictly Come Dancing? How did you end up doing?
Well, I did well, actually. I got a 10 from Len and from Craig Revel Hallwood. It wasn't bad. It crippled my back for months as I attempted a lift of my partner that didn't quite work. But yeah, as an experience, it was great. I never regretted doing it.
Tuition fees. I really want to speak about this. As a young person, a lot of people around me are going to go to university, and they're finding themselves going to be putting themselves in a lot of debt in the next few years. The Green Party have come out and made a very ambitious claim to scrap tuition fees, and the government will cover the costs. So, what could be done in this day-to-day world where either we lower the tuition fees or we completely scrap them, or is it literally not possible at all?
No, and the Green Party are just being wildly stupid and irresponsible. They know perfectly well that no government can provide university tuition free of charge. Absolutely no way. I mean, you'd have to close down most of the universities because they wouldn't be able to continue. The government does not have the funds to do anything remotely of the kind. The issue was exactly how the repayment should take place. And I think most reasonable people, including Labour Party, Tory Party, most, I suspect even the Reform people would accept that there had to be some kind of fee loan arrangement. Now, we tried to make it as fair as possible by having a high threshold for repayment. We had initially, anyway, low interest rates. And although people were angry about the fact that their pledge had been broken, I think most people accepted that the system we had, which was a system of basically a kind of graduate tax, 9p in the pound for 30-year period, that's what it amounted to, was the only way we could continue to finance university. So if that's what the Green Party is saying, I'm very worried for the future of the country because that is just wildly, wildly silly. And I hope somebody takes them to task for it.
So, in terms of tuition fees, a lot of people now are aiming towards apprenticeships or different routes to try and get into a full-time job as a young person. So, in this day and age, do you still recommend going to university, or would you say perhaps it's a bit outdated?
No, I think you should look at all the options. And actually, one of the things I did when I was in the government was to encourage people to look at apprenticeships because we had built in the UK a kind of snobbery that anybody who works with their hands is somehow inferior, and clever people go to university, and it was a kind of class system that was very pernicious and actually led to a situation where we're chronically short of skilled people. And for many people, going into an apprenticeship where you're learning and being paid for it is a much superior alternative. And some of the apprenticeship schemes, in the top companies like Rolls-Royce or BT and so on, are world class and they're more difficult to get into than going to Oxford and Cambridge. So for a lot of young people, that's a better idea. The idea that you just go to universities because you've got a couple of C's at A level and the next 3 years will take care of themselves. I mean, that is not a good way to think about the future.
2015 came about, and you lost your seat in Parliament once more. You had a majority in the previous election of over 12,000. What do you think went wrong? Why do you think you lost your seat? Because ultimately, what we seem to find out is once there's a coalition government, one of the parties often has a very big downfall.
Well, that's what happened, and all my colleagues in a similar position, many of them very, very good MPs, had the same experience as I did. But basically, what did it was that the Conservatives ran a very clever campaign saying that, your Lib Dem MPs, and I was one of the people singled out, are very good. They've been good MPs. They played a good role in the coalition, etc. We got nothing against them. However, if you vote for them, you will let in a government dominated by the Scottish National Party and by Ed Miliband's Red Ed's Labour Party. And a lot of middle class voters were alarmed, and it swung votes very heavily. And a lot of us lost our seats as a result. When people had had a chance to reflect on it, as they did 2 years later, everything was reversed. I mean, I was back in Parliament with majority fairly close to what I'd had before we lost.
What was your day in the life like? So your average day in Parliament, because I know Twickenham isn't too far from Parliament. So when it was a Wednesday, when it was 12 p.m, when it's PMQs, what was your day-to-day life like on that day?
Well, there are many, many different things that MPs do. You either running campaigns or maybe just some sort of local issue you're immersed with. So you may be on a parliamentary select committee which sit during the mornings. So on a Wednesday morning, probably I would go down to the constituency office, sign a lot of letters, check where we were on local issues, go into town, maybe sit in a committee for an hour or so. Then you normally sit in PMQs, you don't have to. And then after the PMQs, there would very often be a statement by a minister on a topical issue. And if you're the spokesman, as I was on economic issues, you'd stay behind, or otherwise just stay behind and ask questions in the subsequent questioning process. So most of your afternoon would be taken up in that way. Maybe then there would be some legislation. You may or may not be involved in it. And you'd be back in your office trying to deal with correspondence, maybe an evening since I was in London MP, meeting in the constituency, a public debate, a planning issue, and you'd go along and contribute.
Well, it seems like an MP's life is utterly busy. And talk to me about preparing a question, asking a question in front of hundreds of people in the chamber.
Well, there's a fairly stylized system, and once you get used to it, it's not a particularly kind of emotional experience. But I asked hundreds, if not thousands, of questions. Many of them are questions in writing, written questions, they're called, and you get a usually fairly evasive reply from a government minister. You also trying every day to put your name in a ballot to be called for an oral question. So maybe there's 100 MPs applying to ask 15 or 20 questions. One in every 6 you'd be called. You put down a question which relates probably to your constituency or other interests, and then you get your turn to ask a question. It's not very dramatic. They're not very revealing, but it's quite a good way of keeping ministers under some sort of pressure. I used to very often put in the weekly ballot for an adjourned debate. I had dozens of them, where you get 15 minutes with a minister as opposed to just asking a question, which is a very good way of keeping an issue in the public eye.
How hard is it to pass anything? Because around in my area, they're just passing an expansion to make the train station accessible for all. So they're adding another lift. And that has taken nearly a year and a half to bring in. So for you as a minister, as a cabinet minister, but also for you when you were just your local MP, what was it like? How hard is it to pass something like that through?
Well, that particular problem you're describing, I mean, I remember similar things in my own local stations. I mean, it's down to Railtrack, I think, who are a government entity. And what you probably do, certainly I did, is if things are not progressing very rapidly, you would ask for a meeting with the chief executive of Railtrack or the regional manager. You take them to the station and get them to explain why it was all so difficult. And just generally keep up pressure. I mean, that's the best you can do. If you're a minister, you have to be rather careful because you're not allowed under ministerial rules to push for special privileges for your own constituency. So I would have to get another minister to speak on my behalf if I wanted to do something to help the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington or some other local facility.
On a Wednesday, after PMQs, a lot of people, a lot of MPs end up in the Westminster Arms. So what has your experience been like in the Westminster Arms?
I don't think I've ever been in the Westminster Arms, partly because I'm not a drinker and partly because my friends and so on tended to socialise in a different way. I mean, actually, what would quite often happen if you're hanging around Parliament for a day, waiting for the bells to ring for a division, you'd wander in and have a chat to your colleagues. There's a coffee bar down in Portcullis House. As I say, I've never been an enthusiast for alcohol, so it didn't really captivate me.
Perhaps that's why you're looking so good for your age. So, yeah, I mean, fair enough. So, talk to me about you being the leader. In 2017, you were the oldest leader in a major UK political party since Winston Churchill. And during this time, though, you did also suffer a stroke. Would you say it's because of the stress that you had to deal with over the last 10 or 15 years?
Well, I don't want to blame Parliament. Maybe my own lifestyle wasn't ideal. I, I could have blamed the low cost airline I just used to take my wife on a holiday to Italy, which is when this happened. And I think they turned the oxygen down because the plane was idling for 2 or 3 hours. And that's when it happened. So I'm not blaming anybody, but it happens. Late middle age, it's quite common. I was very, very well looked after by the health authorities in Italy. I hadn't realised Italy had a very good health service. I got back to the UK and got very good treatment at the local hospital. I wasn't taken in. I was an outpatient, and gradually life returned to normal. I mean, there were some very awkward bits because I didn't want to advertise it. Because in Westminster, if you're seen as being ill, people say, we're very sorry, but, they see you as a weakened animal, but like a wounded wildebeest on the plains of Serengeti, and they're out to eat you. So my instincts were to keep quiet about it, which was unfortunate because there were several episodes where I blacked out when I was speaking or, a public event. People thought I was underperforming or not doing my job, which became quite tricky.
You resigned in 2019, and obviously that was around the Brexit time. Talk to me just very briefly about bollocks for Brexit. You ran the campaign, and obviously the Liberal Democrats were very pro-EU, and they still are.
Yes, well, we had what we thought was a successful campaign to have a referendum, a confirmatory referendum. And it was a bit sort of touch and go. There was never quite a majority in Parliament, mainly because a significant number of Labour MPs supported Brexit or certainly opposed attempts to reopen the issue. We never got to a majority in Parliament, so we spent 2 years essentially on procedural wrangling about what to do. There was just a possibility that Parliament might have got behind Ken Clarke's attempt to stay in the customs union, but that failed by 2 or 3 votes. We just didn't have the majority. I think what then happened was a move was made to have an early general election. I think it was an unfortunate mistake. And it resulted in an election where Boris Johnson was able to deploy this, very successful Get Brexit Done campaign. And people have been concerned about it. I by then retired, but we just lost the argument.
So look, Brexit for a lot of people has been a good thing. Brexit for many people has been a negative thing, and obviously nothing's ever going to be perfect. Just to name two things that have happened recently. So obviously we've got that historic trade deal with India, and we are outperforming growth compared to France and Germany. So what would you say has been the real negatives of leaving the European Union?
Well, they're quite easily measured. There's been a very, very sharp decline in British exports to Europe and in the British exports overall. And when you drill into that problem, you realize it's largely because small and medium sized companies have been very, very, deterred by the amount of paperwork and bureaucracy that they now have to get through in order to export to Europe. We used to have a single market, it's not there anymore. And it's very, very damaging to British performance overall. And I think the second thing, which is related to that, is that business stopped investing because of all the uncertainty about the future, the shock to the system. There was a big hiatus, a big stoppage, and people have now quantified the effects of Brexit. And I think there's a reasonable consensus, and even government confirms this. It's about 4 to 8% of GDP was lost and is never going to be retrieved, which partly explained the fact that we're a poorer country. People have become more bad-tempered because they can't get what they want in terms of services, and I think a third and finally is a psychological thing that people have just. One of the reasons why the country is in such a bad mood is this general feeling of disappointment, of being let down. That people were promised that there would be lots more money for the health service if we left the European Union. It was always a lie. And it's now been established as one. So you've just generally got this feeling of cynicism. When you try to analyse why Brexit happened, I mean, there are different theories. I don't claim there's any one factor, but it's very clear that the key determinant was age. The over 65s voted heavily for Brexit. The under 30s, under 25s voted heavily to remain. So there was a kind of generation issue. And I think older people of my generation, were a bit nostalgic for the past when, Britain was a great power and we didn't have to be part of some messy arrangement with other European countries. Whereas young people could see the point about working closely with neighbouring countries and moving freely amongst them. And as the population has moved on, it's very clear that there's now a large majority who feel that it was a mistake.
On the night of the referendum, but also when you're just campaigning and having the election night anyway, there must be so many nerves, but what is the main emotion that captured you?
So I didn't capture that.
What's the main emotion that you feel on election night?
Well, in my case, I never got particularly charged up about it. It was usually clear, except in that awful election in 2015, it was usually clear what was going to happen. I mean, certainly my campaign team, most are pretty efficient in their canvassing. You know where the votes are. You know whether you're ahead or behind 1,000 or so either way. If it's a very close election, you can be very tense, but it's not. It's not normally the sort of tight nerve experience that people describe. So I usually went into election night just dreading having to sit up all night and not get any sleep, and that was as much I felt. But 2015, of course, was a different story.
The next election could be any moment now, but obviously it could be around 2028, 2029. The future of politics in this country is certainly going to change. We've seen the rise in Reform, the rise in the Greens. The Liberal Democrats did incredibly well at the next election. The two main parties all of a sudden don't look so powerful anymore. So for you, who is going to win this next election?
Well, first of all, I don't think there will be an early election. It doesn't need to be, and I don't think there will be. And when it comes, a significant factor will be the British voting system, which people tend to forget. We constantly talk about public opinion polls, but governments are not chosen by public opinion polls. They're chosen under our constituency system, which was massively disadvantageous to small parties like the Lib Dems or the Greens. But the Lib Dems have learned to work with the system. And at the last election, we had, 12% of the vote and 12% of the parliamentary seats. And what the Lib Dems are now quietly doing is making sure that we're very well organised in those areas where we think we can win and potentially get over 100 seats in Parliament. The Reform Party and the Green Party are making a lot of noise. It's not obvious where they're going to win more seats. They may well, but it's not obvious how they will do it because they've got to master the British voting system. Which is, unfair, needs reform, but it's there. That's the fact of life. I think looking behind the mechanics of the election, what we have seen is a kind of civil war on the right. I mean, the failure of the last Tory government was quite deep, and you've now got three right-wing parties, the Tories, Reform, and this Rupert Lowe party, which is supposedly being backed by Elon Musk. I mean, who knows? And it's not clear how that civil war is going to evolve and whether those three parties will be competing against each other at the next election. On the other side, the Green Party are currently doing well in the public opinion polls. They may well win quite a lot of seats in May. But whether it's a sustained force and what it will do to the Labour Party's vote, we don't know. But so you've got essentially a three-way civil war on the right, a two-way war on the left between Labour and the Greens, and we're somewhere in the middle. So I think if you're asking me to predict an outcome, I honestly don't know. I think the Lib Dems will certainly make advances in our quiet way. I think the most likely of a whole lot of scenarios is that the Labour come back, but with a much reduced majority, and may well then turn to smaller parties to try to help them. And that will be the moment of truth, because who would want to work with a government that's already becoming unpopular?
So you firmly believe that the Liberal Democrats will get 100 seats in the next election?
I think that's fairly conservative. I think we can do even better, but it wouldn't surprise me if we got to that level.
The Conservative Party you mentioned there is still suffering after the last election and 14 years of being in government. Do you think the Conservative Party is going to die? Is the party already dead?
There is a possibility that they may. I mean, I keep pointing out to people from liberal history, there was a moment in 1923 when the Liberal Party, which had been one of the two big parties for a century, had been in government. The 1906-1910 Liberal government was thought to be one of the most radical and best governments in modern history. Lloyd George had been the wartime leader. But the combination of factors, including squabbling between Lloyd George and Asquith, led to the two different wings of the Liberal Party competing against each other in 1923. And of course, it was suicidal. And the Liberal Party was almost wiped out within the course of two general elections and replaced by the Labour Party. And it could be that what's now happening on the right could have a similar effect.
Well, we've seen the Reform Party gauge a lot of interest from a lot of people, but also ministers within the Conservative Party, one of them being Robert Jenrick or Suella Braverman. You mentioned Reform there making a lot of noise. Do you think that they will get the majority that they so desperately want?
No, I don't think they will. It's possible, but I don't think so. I mean, Nigel Farage is a very, very good communicator, for sure. I mean, he's on television, he's far, far better than either the Prime Minister or the leader of the Tories. You know, he's slick, he's clever, funny, and articulate. and it goes quite a long way. But I think his party is already becoming discredited on several fronts. First of all, he was the leader of the Brexit campaign, which we now accept was not a good thing for the country. He was very associated with Mr. Trump. There's that infamous photograph of them grinning together. And Trump is not a popular man in the UK by any means. And he's now brought back these rather discredited figures from the Conservative era as part of his team. So I think you add all that together and, they have problems.
My last question to you would be, what would be your advice to any young person out there who wants to run as a member of parliament? Would you encourage it or would you discourage it? And what would be your advice?
Well, the answer to that question is in my book, which is called How to Be a Politician, which is a semi-satirical book I wrote for Penguin a few years ago. And there is an obvious cynical response, is why on earth would anybody want to do a job where you're in very low standing with the public and constantly abused and there's no job security? And I can think of a dozen reasons why young people might not want to do it. But my conclusion would be that it is actually a worthwhile thing to do. You can actually change things for the better, and it's worth trying.
Well, Vince, thank you very, very much for joining me on the podcast. What an absolute pleasure it's been. And thank you so much for joining me again.
Thank you.